All right, everybody, welcome to Chapter 9, the Confederation and the Constitution. Let's get started. Just a few key points. Victory in the War of Independence actually put all the problems that the British had in the West on the shoulders of the Americans. It also exposed debates in the now states over the true nature of government. And then there's a question of sort of like the ideal situation and then the practical solution to that. So what do we want to see happen, and then how do we actually carry that out? Those are two different things. All right, keep in mind that states had constitutions. The fundamental orders of Connecticut, for example, predated the Revolution by quite some time. Many of those state constitutions also had bills of rights included, and many required the annual election of legislators. So these constitutions often feared a strong central government, and the Articles of Confederation will certainly do that as well. A couple of ideas being kicked around after the Revolution. First of all, this concept of Republican motherhood. Still, ladies are not really considered to be a part of political life, but they were given the task of raising young Republicans, and the small R Republicans there, I mean that, of course. Other ideas such as religious freedom can be cited in the Virginia Statute of Religious Freedom. This was something that Thomas Jefferson loved so much, he actually wanted it on his tombstone, as you can see here. We also have the concept of popular sovereignty, democratic participation in politics, that the people should have a say, or government by consent. Now, the first national government will be the Articles of Confederation, and it is not a strong central government. It is intentionally designed to be weak, and again, that is related to the fear we had of tyrants and tyranny. Some of the negatives: there's no executive. There will be no king in the United States. There's no judicial, or no strong judicial branch, we should say. Also, representation in the national legislative body is going to be based on an equal standing. Each state will have one vote. Unfortunately, we need a supermajority for decisions to be made. And in fact, we need unanimous support to revise the Articles of Confederation. Also, the Congress cannot enforce its own taxes. It can request taxes, but that's it. The reason for that is because people fear taxation as sort of the pathway to tyranny. Now, in class, I said that the Articles of Confederation was a government of necessity and a government of the times. The previous slide really exposes the times, the trends in American political thinking: weak centralized government and protection against tyranny. State sovereignty is just that. The government by necessity, well, that is the formal union of the states. We have to have some sort of label and organization if we are to be a national body. It also clearly defined powers, and as you can see here, created a post office, or the post office. The two biggest successes, though, which are both related to the same thing, are the Land Ordinance of 1785, which organized the Northwest Territory and began the selling off process of it, and the Northwest Land Ordinance, which said that all new states will be equal states, will be on equal standing to the pre-existing states, will not have colonies in the United States. Also, in the Northwest Territory, there are provisions made for education, including the sale of land that goes towards that, and freedom of religion is guaranteed in the Northwest Territory, and slavery is abolished as well. Obviously, that'll have effects down the road. Here you can see sort of the folks who have claims to land in North America. On our western border now will be the Spanish, as the French have been removed. Obviously, the Mississippi River is something we'll be talking about soon enough, as is the Louisiana Purchase in 1803. So one of the major issues that the United States has to deal with will be the western lands, and obviously the Northwest Ordinance that I just mentioned will help to deal with that as well. But you have to understand that various states had conflicting land claims. As you can see, Connecticut here, where I'm from, has a claim that is about the same height as the state of Connecticut that extended all the way to our western border, and that overlapped with New York's claims and Virginia's claims and so forth. And so the states will eventually cede those land claims to the national government, and that therefore sort of opens the door for a national move in that Northwest Territory. So the land ordinance, as you can see, divided the land up and also created this provision for selling of one parcel of land off for public education. But if you have flown out to the west over the flyover states, then you might recognize this sort of patchwork look that you see here. Also opening the door for this would be the Treaty of Grenville. Native Americans were basically assigning themselves a position of inferiority in this treaty, as well as ceding land. Again, with the land ordinance here, you can see a little bit of a close-up of that structure. Now, the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, as I said before, created the pathway to equal standing, and it's based on population. Here in New England, we have signs all over saying the town of Essex founded in such and such date. Out west, you often see a population on that sign or town sign. And again, because the population, the number 60,000, is what signified that the state was ready to apply for statehood and write a constitution. Under the weak national government of the Articles of Confederation, the national government had very little authority or power to actually act. And so the government used this tradition of the Charter of Compact approach to promote unity and, in fact, extend the Union. It extended an incentive to new states. And the incentive is that if you go west on your own and you develop the land and you live there, then you will be guaranteed equal standing when you're ready for that, when the state reaches this predetermined level of 60,000 people and writes a constitution, they'll be on equal standing. Aside from land issues, the United States now is, well, it's a member of the international community, and therefore it has to deal with foreign nations such as Britain, which have closed off trade in the West Indies, and is encouraging natives on the frontier to raid colonial towns and villages. Spain has closed access to the Mississippi River and also is favoring the Native Americans against this new United States. So the Mississippi is going to be, the way that Western grains and products are brought to market. Well, it can't be, at least if the Spanish have closed off access to it. There's also pirates in the Mediterranean, the Barbary pirates that are attacking American ships. All of these are big issues for this new young republic. Oh, and the French demanded that we repay the loans that they extended to us during the American Revolution. There are also domestic concerns such as Shays Rebellion. A former military man, Daniel Shays, will lead a rebellion of poor farmers who can't afford to pay their taxes, or perhaps are having their farms foreclosed upon. Does that sound familiar, by the way, as it says there? This rebellion was something that was put down by Massachusetts and the Massachusetts militia because there was no national army under the Articles of Confederation. And that, in fact, encouraged a lot of people to start thinking that perhaps a strong central government was, in fact, needed. There was an Annapolis convention. Not everybody showed up. As you can see, only 5 states sent delegates. Alexander Hamilton's in charge. They don't really do anything except promise to have another convention the following year. And the goal of that convention is to revise the Articles of Confederation. There's Alexander Hamilton. Now, the following year, the Philadelphia Convention, the purpose again is to revise the Articles of Confederation, but instead they scrap it all together and they create the Constitution. So, from May to September, it's very hot in Philadelphia, and shrouded in secrecy, 55 men who don't really represent the overall population of the United States came together, closed the doors and windows, and drafted a new government. It's a very iconic image of the signing of the Constitution, right? Now, the Constitution includes several compromises that are in many ways related to one another, but the concept of compromise is a key component of the document. We look at the legislative body. Larger states wanted to have representation in the National Congress be based on population. That would favor them. So this is going to be states like Virginia, and this proposal comes to be known as the Virginia Plan. Smaller states would prefer that we continue to use the method that was used under the Articles, in which each state received equal representation. Shout out to Connecticut and the Great Compromise. Thank you, Roger Sherman. He proposes a bicameral legislature with one house based on population. That'll be the House of Reps. They, by the way, have the power of the purse, right? Let the people remain close to the taxes, and any revenue-related or financial-related bill has to originate in the House of Reps. That's what we mean by the power of the purse. And the upper house will have representation based on equal standing. This is the Senate. And the Senate, by the way, has the power to negotiate treaties with foreign nations. So again, you sort of appease both sides. So if representation is going to be based on population in one house, then we have another issue to deal with. That is, how do we figure out population? Because the South's going to have a large slave population. Should those count? Well, the compromise comes to be known as the 3/5 compromise. And basically it says that in terms of determining population towards representation in the House, only 60% of slaves will be counted. Another compromise is the issue of the slave trade. In the Northwest Ordinance, slavery is abolished outright in those new soon-to-be states. But the slave trade itself will not be debated on until the end of 1807. So for about 20 years or so, we won't even discuss the slave trade, another compromise to appease the slave interest. There's also this creation of the Electoral College. Now, the Electoral College was a way to elect the president other than a popular vote, and the concern is that the people are not really well suited to choose a president, and therefore a group of men will be assigned to cast the official vote for president. Now, in the modern day, these Electoral College delegates they're supposed to confirm the popular vote of the state, but originally it was designed they would choose the best candidate. We also have the elastic clause within the Constitution, or also known as the necessary and proper clause. We'll talk about this in the debates between Jefferson and Hamilton, right? Especially over the Bank of the U.S. The elastic clause allows the government to do things that are not explicitly said in the Constitution. If it doesn't say you can't do it, then it's assumed that the government can. Here, by the way, is a map of the United States. Obviously, this is a modern map from 2012, and it shows all of the states currently in the Union and the electoral votes that each has. It's based on the number of senators plus the number of representatives in the House of Reps that each state has. So not everybody favored the new government. After the Philadelphia Convention, public opinion was somewhat divided. Those that did favor the new Constitution came to be known as Federalists. This is not the political party, the Federalists, that occurred under the Constitution, although Hamilton was a Federalist, and later we'd say John Adams was certainly a Federalist. We're just talking about people here who supported the new Constitution. So Madison, Hamilton, and John Jay, the three of them actually will write essays called the Federalist Papers, which are trying to encourage the people to, in fact, adopt the new government. Obviously, those that opposed the new government became to be known as the Anti-federalists. And folks like Patrick Henry, above all, were afraid that this new government would become tyrannical and usurp our rights. So when the Federalists promised to add the Bill of Rights to the document, the Anti-federalists were somewhat appeased, and they therefore began to support the creation of the new government. And here's a picture of Hamilton on the left, James Madison in the center, also known as the father of the Constitution, and John Jay on the right, who becomes our first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. The Federalist Papers, as I've referenced on the previous slide, are iconic documents in American political history and American political thought. Two that you should probably know are Fed 10 and Fed 51. In Fed 10, Madison argues that factions will definitely emerge. Factions, these are groups. They're not necessarily political parties, but they're groups of common interests. And factions are something that people were definitely afraid of. They're afraid that the people would have emotions sort of dictating their behavior and therefore act upon it rather than logic or reason. That's one reason why we have the Electoral College created to begin with. But in a nutshell, Madison argues that you can't limit factions that are going to exist, therefore you should limit the effects of them. And the larger the republic is, the more interests there are, the more those factions can naturally balance each other out. And so this is sort of an argument that counters the old idea that a republic has to be small. This sort of says that a republic can be big. In fact, the bigger it is, the healthier it will be. In Fed 51, Madison argues for the separation of powers. Again, another enlightened idea, thank you Montesquieu, right, of checks and balances, or as it says here, ambition must be made to counteract ambition. We're afraid that one branch will just assume too much power, and this is a way to check that. Now, in some states like Virginia and New York, there was a strong anti-federalist approach, and both of those states were actually sort of late to come to the table and ratify the Constitution. But generally speaking, they feared the new, stronger government would threaten republicanism, and it would threaten our rights as individuals and as states for that. They feared the new government would be too far removed from the people, that it would be dominated by special interests. They feared the emergence of an aristocracy, and they feared the loss of states' rights. Speaking of states' rights, states should have the right to tax their own residents, and the fear that Patrick Henry would be vocal about was that if we had concurrent taxation, if we're taxed by the federal government and the state government, then that in itself is a pathway to tyranny, as I said earlier in this presentation. One of the fears I referenced a few slides back is this fear of an aristocracy. You know, you can make the case that the 55 men who came together in Philadelphia really don't reflect the general population. They may see themselves as a natural aristocracy, though, as opposed to an entitled aristocracy from the old world, but they were far wealthier than the average person. Almost half of them were war veterans, and more than half of them were college educated in a time where, as you can see, 0.001% of Americans actually attended college. Now, anti-federalist leaders often did reflect that sort of natural aristocracy, but those who came to believe more in the anti-federalist political position often were folks from the West. And this is sort of an ongoing idea we're going to be talking about here, these regional interests. Later on in the mid-19th century, we're going to be using the phrase, right, sectionalism to talk about sectional interests and so forth. But farmers in the West, they don't really identify with the same issues of the East. They're more agrarian than they are perhaps this young industrial emerging class. They also have distinct specific issues to deal with, such as law and order, infrastructure, and constant threat of outsider attacks. You know, Westerners and anti-federalists and so forth that, you know, are afraid of a centralized government and are dealing with distinct regional interests where they live, you know, they are asking that same question that we did during the Revolution of who should rule at home. Shouldn't we have local autonomy? Isn't that what started this whole conflict to begin with, at least in an ideological sense? So the framers sent off the Constitution to the states. Special state conventions were called to debate on this. And as you can see here, June 21st, 1788, the Constitution was officially adopted after 9 states, all but Virginia, New York, North Carolina, and Rhode Island, had ratified the document. Remember again that, you know, Virginia is a big state, as is New York. And as I said earlier, there was strong anti-federalist support there. It was that promise of the Bill of Rights which helped to usher that through. So take a look at the map here. You can see the Federalist majority for ratification, and you can see the politically unorganized in this big green area, and you can see the anti-federalists. And you can see from all of that, this really is a minority movement. Only about a quarter of the adult males in the country, mainly those that were propertied, had actually voted for the ratifying delegates, those that went and voted for the Constitution. So it's somewhat of a conservative triumph, as you can see. But there have been safeguards now put in place against mob rule excesses. And as you can see, the revolutionaries against Britain had been upended by revolutionaries against the Articles. And in a way, it's somewhat of a counter-revolution. That's it for Chapter 9. Thank you so much for watching. Try to keep it brief. If you have any questions, please just post them below or let me know in class. Take care.